Thanks everyone. So I'm going to be going off in a quite different direction than Richard did in this sort of combined event, which, as it turns out, is the opening night of the Transcontinental Richard Seymour Peter Frey's speaking tour that will have its second and final date in Boston next month. That one was planned. This was not as much planned. So these books our books are both about socialism, but in pretty much completely different ways. Whereas Richard is talking about the day-to-day of moving, forward the project of building a left Labor Party that can contest power and capitalism. I'm talking about something Richard mentioned in the end, the project of eventually moving beyond capitalism altogether. And this book is a thought experiment, essentially. It's an attempt to update our vision and our imagination about what possible post-capitalist futures would look like. Because I think that's needed. I think much of what the old sort of socialist and Marxist tradition in that sense is relevant, but much of it is not. And there's sort of a need for, as Satya said, this sort of vision and imagination that drives people to do, day-to-day things like, organizing their constituency Labor Party. And so, where I'm going to start, telling you the structure of this book is with austerity, which is at the center of the whole Corbyn, phenomenon, of course, the fight against austerity. And I think one of the things, both, in the United States, where I'm from, and here, that motivates people in the struggle against austerity is the recognition that it is an artificial austerity, an imposed austerity, that is mandated not by some fact of nature or fact of the economy, but that is a political decision that benefits a few and that makes the rest suffer. And that relates to a fundamental concern of the entire socialist movement, one of the things that animated it, which was the dream of abundance, of the anti-austerity world in which we can in fact live lives of unprecedented leisure and minimal work. And this basic argument has been there since the beginning of capitalism, that the productivity of a capitalist economy in capitalism only benefits the capitalist class for the most part, but that in another form of society could benefit all of us. And so the starting point of this book is to sketch out sort of a premise. What if, let me back up a second. There's been a resurgence of interest lately and fear lately about the prospect of automation, robotization, computerization, algorithms, things that replace human labor, potentially take jobs, potentially create the jobless future, which in a capitalist society is, of course, the nightmare scenario where people are dependent upon wage labor, and if they're cut off from it, they become destitute. Just on the way here from the US, I was riding Norwegian Air, and I picked up the In-Flight magazine, and there was a big spread about the rise of automation and whether you should be scared of it. It seems to be everywhere now. And I should stress that this is not a new anxiety. In fact, it has existed as long as industrial capitalism has existed. But I think we're seeing another wave of it. And the point, as it always has been, is that the capitalist drive toward increasing productivity is a fundamental feature of the system, and that part of the socialist and Marxist critique is that without fundamental changes of social relations, we cannot take advantage of the possibility that holds. So this book starts as a thought experiment by saying, well, okay, what if it were possible to sort of automate everything, to essentially remove the need for human labor from the system? And so from there I sketch out 4 sort of possible futures that one might imagine. Simplified, exaggerated, intended to draw out certain specific problematics, certain specific issues. And the way I get to those 4 futures is through an elaboration of an old concept from the German socialist Rosa Luxemburg, that we face the choice between moving forward into socialism or regressing into barbarism. But instead of 2 futures, I have 4. So the way this works, and unfortunately I don't have the ability to do the visual here, is by a sort of a 2x2 grid that gives you these futures, right? So we presupposed sort of the automated future. What are the other issues we have to think about? Well, the first axis I call is the ecological axis. So this is the question of climate change, of resource scarcity, the carrying capacity of the Earth. So even if human labor can be reduced to a minimum, we can't sort of have arbitrarily high levels of stuff if the Earth cannot support it. And so to the extent that we are unable to overcome that by moving to renewable energy, finding ways to address climate change, so on and so forth, to the extent that we are limited in that way, we face a real scarcity, not the artificial scarcity of capitalism, but a real scarcity that must be organized in some way. So that's sort of one point of differentiation. The other point of differentiation is what I call the axis of class struggle. In other words, is it the hierarchical society we live in now, in which power and material wealth are monopolized by an elite, or is it an egalitarian society, the sort of the dream of socialism? And that is sort of where the politics comes into this. And this book is in some ways an intervention into the kind of futurist genre of book that tries to tell you this is what the future things are going to be like in 50 years when all these magical technologies come online. And either it's the dystopia where nobody has a job, or it's wonderful because, it's like, it's good, technology is going to solve all our problems. And my argument in the book is that this political axis is the most important one in terms of saying that it's a matter of collective struggle. It's a matter of the outcome of things like, the struggle over the Labor Party that determines exactly how this stuff plays out in the future. So I'll just so the four futures are basically laid out in 4 chapters that fall into these 4 boxes. And the sort of odd way in which I chose to do the book was to mix together, resources from social science, empirical stuff that's going on in the present, with citations from science fiction, in order to give sort of texture to these futures, because I want them to seem not just sort of like, somewhat less like dry abstractions. So I'll start with the kind of the super utopia, which is what I call communism, drawing on the sort of schematic reading of Marx that you often hear that says there's these 2 stages. You have socialism, where the state controls the means of production, and then you have communism, where, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, and the free association of producers pursues projects as they like. And if you're unconstrained by scarcity, and you're unconstrained by the need for much human labor, then you live in this world. And sort of the first tricky thing in thinking about this is to think about then, what are the sort of like conflicts and problems of this world? Because often people hear this, and their first thought is obviously, well, it's so, utopian, why even bother thinking about it? But also, like, is this the end of history? Where does sort of challenge and interest and conflict and, any sort of, sort of texture to human life come from? And so I explore in the book just sort of the various ways in which different kinds of sort of status hierarchies, different kinds of conflicts within even sort of smaller groups can play out in a world where you no longer have sort of capital and labor as that master sort of magnet of capital and labor drawing all other kinds of social conflict into its orbit. So I talk about some of the examples, for example, that people who are sort of utopian about the possibilities of sort of voluntary sort of techno-communism in the present. We'll talk about, for example, Wikipedia, the collective. Anybody can come and edit Wikipedia. But of course, if you read about the history of Wikipedia, there are all kinds of problems having to do with small cliques of editors controlling articles, disproportionate numbers of the articles being written by men, and then therefore the subject matter being tilted in certain ways, various complicated fights over edits. None of this stuff is sort of reducible to, the existence of wage labor, the existence of the capital relation that I started off with. But it's the sort of thing that will arise in any kind of collectivity that tries to undertake a common project, which I imagine is what people would often like to do when they are freed from the demands of labor. And so, I cite one of the science fiction works I cite is by the American author Cory Doctorow, in which in a sort of a post-scarcity society in which a bunch of people take over and collectively run Disneyland. And all kinds of crazy infighting and fights and conflicts happen, none of which are about money or about material need, right? So that's the sort of direction that's the sort of problem I want to draw out, is the sort of like what happens to social conflict once you remove the capital relation. So that's future 1. Future 2 is actually the first one I thought of. The first thing I ever wrote that led to this book was an essay only about this world. And so it's asking, we still have total abundance, total possibility to produce without labor, but the interesting thing here is so many of these kind of bourgeois futurist writers sort of assume, well, if we have this capability to do that, we will do it, right? And the utopia here is like the Star Trek TV series, where they have machines where at the push of a button you can have anything you want. It seems like it's essentially a kind of a communist society in which people sort of, if you want to get in a spaceship and fly around, you can, but you don't have to. You don't have to do anything as far as. But the problem is that, of course, the capitalist class won't simply allow that future to arise simply because it's materially possible. The insight being that control over money and capital is a form of social power, not just a way of accruing stuff, and that therefore there's a desire to maintain that power. And so the second chapter is about a system I refer to as rentism, because in the absence of much of sort of material production by means of human labor, what you get is a lot of stuff that's based on rent. So rent in the traditional sense, such as rent on land, is there. But then it's extended to new forms of property, specifically intellectual property, that allow the owner to extract a stream of rents for something like a digital copy of a movie, or that can be copied for free, or a pharmaceutical that's almost free to produce, but that can be sold at huge markup because of patent ownership. And the sort of like the chapter walks through the various peculiarities and contradictions of this kind of society, which include the problem of if you want to sort of accumulate money as a form of social power, you need people to pay for the licensing fee to replicate stuff. But if there's no need for human labor, how do people earn the money? You need some jobs probably for lawyers to sue people and guards to lock them up for illegal copying. But there's problems of underemployment, there's problems of stagnation, and I sort of go through the various sort of contradictions of that kind of a society. And in fact, the opening vignette for that chapter is from a Scottish science fiction author, Charles Stross, and his book Accelerando, which opens in a world that somewhat resembles the one that I sketch out in that chapter. So, then that's Future 2. Leaving the world of abundance, we get into the question of how do we deal with things like the effects of the climate crisis. First of all, how do we deal with them in an egalitarian way? And this is where the sort of old socialist problematics, I call this world socialism because the old socialist problematic of economic planning comes back on the agenda. It's not quite the same problem because we're still not talking about needs for massive amounts of human labor. It's not so much planning production as it is consumption, both consumption of the inputs essentially to any kind of replicator or whatever 3D printer or automatic production technology. It's a matter of sort of balancing the sort of load that people put on the earth. And so here I go into a couple of different themes, one of which has to do with the sort of production of nature, as the geographer Neil Smith put it, or the management of nature, the way in which a lot of environmentalist tropes sort of entail that, humans are a blight on nature and we need to sort of withdraw from it and get it back to its pristine state, but that in fact the eco-socialist world is one of like increasing entanglement with nature and increasing modification of nature because nature is essentially us and it's essentially becoming, it's a management of the natural environment, I think, inevitably. And then the second aspect of it is to talk a little bit about, I talk a little bit about economic planning and the way the sort of older arguments about planning relate to the things that I'm talking about here. But then I also go to the debate about planning and markets, and the idea that markets are often seen on the left and by Marxists as sort of antithetical to the socialist project, but that the way I see it, that has more to do with the unequal endowment of resources and money in capitalism, which means that insofar as things are determined through market exchange, whoever has more money has more power in that exchange. But in a system in which, for example, you sort of allocate access to resources in a fairly egalitarian way, some types of limited markets could be sort of a technical mechanism for managing scarcity without having endless meetings or planning boards or whatever. So those are the things I sort of draw out in that chapter. Finally, we get to this super crazy dystopian chapter that everyone thinks is either ridiculous or can't stop talking about long enough to get to the other parts. So we have scarcity, but now we have not won the class struggle. So now where are we? Well, here I get at a central thing, the central contradiction of the relationship between capital and labor that is in older forms of capitalism, which is a relationship of mutual dependence. Workers depend upon capitalists because they don't control the means of production. They don't have access to the means of survival without selling their labor or their labor power. And the capitalist depends on the workers to produce. And this produces the fundamental contradiction in which workers exercise a tremendous amount of leverage and yet face a tremendous amount of danger in imposing capital. In the sort of world of my premise, the world of the automated future, this is of diminishing importance. The rich are less and less dependent on massive pools of labor. And because there is some fundamental scarcity constraint. The rentist future doesn't work because why? Because the rich are essentially diminishing their own living standards in order to lord it over others. And so then what you get is a dynamic in which there are just huge amounts of populations that are, from the perspective of the rich, purely surplus. And this leads to the kinds of things we see, the things we see around us in terms of just people in their enclave, go from gated cities to private islands to, this sort of, the inverted gulag of wealth surrounded by misery. And, if you have drones and you have robot guards and you have surveillance technology, you can protect yourself from the masses without sort of interacting with them in any way. And so this future is the one, borrowing and repurposing a term from E.P. Thompson, is the one I call exterminism. Because in the long run, these are from the perspective of the rich, again, surplus populations. And whether it doesn't, not necessarily in the form of sort of a, overt, genocidal campaign, but even in the form of neglect. The prospect that mass numbers of people, as in many parts of the world, many mass numbers of people now are, will basically be consigned, will live in refugee camps, will die of disease epidemics, will die in flooding. That's that world, and it's also the world of endless war. It's the world of, the militarization of domestic police forces. So those are the problematics that I draw out of that chapter. And so, to bring it all back, sort of, to where I started, what I want the book to do is give some vision, both of the good and the bad, of sort of what potentially lies ahead, but to do so in a way that's open-ended and not, the problem about sort of what Marx called writing recipes for the kitchens of the future is that, first of all, it's, like Yogi Berra, the baseball player, said, prediction is hard, particularly about the future. And the other problem is that it short-circuits the sort of democratic essence of the socialist project itself. If you try to predict in advance what's going to happen, then you've already foreclosed the very possibility that people can make their own history. So this way, I'm trying to just sort of give these kind of this conceptual matrix as a way of sort of organizing our thinking without falling into that trap. And also, finally, again, to reintroduce to this kind of discourse the fundamental significance of politics and of collective action to determining the directions in which we can go. And I will leave it there and see where we go from here.